Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think People.
Think People is made possible in part by support from the Community Foundation of the Gunnison Valley. To learn how you can make a difference, visit cfgv.org. The Community Foundation, we're here for good.
Become a Think Radio Presents partner at patreon.com, and you'll also get access to premium content you won't find anywhere else. Join us today. My guest today is housing expert Willa Williford. After many years working in the affordable housing field, Williford formed her own consultancy in 2016. The company's mission is to provide practical, expert solutions to housing problems across the Mountain West. And she's achieved a number of notable successes doing just that. On paper, at least, she works for governments, nonprofits, and private agencies alike to create innovative, affordable housing solutions and developments. But she considers her real clients to be the families and others in communities across the West who are most in need of a place to call home. Willa, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I would really love to know your story. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of this very complex issue that we're going to talk about today, how does one become a housing expert? What's the pathway to get there?
Yeah, so I had the very good fortune of finding my way into this field early in my career. I had just graduated from college and moved to Boulder, and I was looking for work in the nonprofit field with my own personal values being about environmental conservation. And I was so fortunate as to be hired by the local housing authority there to work on the Holiday neighborhood, which is a mixed-use, mixed-income, really super cool neighborhood. And pretty early on in that process, I found this is my contribution to sustainability is building great places and understanding that interplay of the human built environment with the natural environment. And from there, I just continued to build in terms of learning my expertise around finance and land use planning and the intricacies of housing policy. And it's really fun work because it's always multifaceted.
Yeah, and that's really an interesting origin story because you say you started off thinking about environmental work and activism and wound up here. But this points to something that I think we've learned over the last few years, a couple of decades, is that these things are all intertwined.
Absolutely.
They really don't belong in separate boxes. It's sort of the triple bottom line approach that human activities can't just be good for the environment. They also have to account for human society and also business and so forth.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Your pathway took you there naturally.
Yeah.
Well, what was it about housing then that made you say, okay, all right, this is it. This is where I belong?
I think it's the problem solving and the complexity, and then the tangible outcomes. I mean, there's no substitute for seeing, members of your community, your friends, your people you work with, housed in a good situation and not doing long or dangerous commutes or having instability from their housing. That very tangible outcome is the greatest sort of success and excitement in my work. And then I think that certainly, what you talk about with the business community and the environmental, building great places, there's sort of a positive synergy among all those things where people are living, transportation, resource conservation. And so when that's working well, you can really appreciate it and measure it. And you can also see when it's in a negative cycle.
Well, I was going to bring that up because you say there's nothing quite as satisfying as seeing people living in a good situation. Probably also nothing quite as heartbreaking as seeing people living in a situation that's not so good.
Absolutely.
Quite a motivator for somebody in your position too.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, appreciating, for example, a family that, that can't kind of get their feet underneath them because their housing isn't stable or it isn't quality, or parents going through a separation who now can't afford to live in separate settings and things like that. It can be very troubling. Certainly, our immediate environment of our housing really affects our health, mental health, physical health, stress. So I see those things very much knit together.
Well, and financial health, because as you pointed out, having to live day to day with this stress and threat of how am I going to pay the rent?
Absolutely.
It's just horrible.
Or will I have to move again? Yeah.
Yeah. Or do I have to choose between paying the rent and medical bills, how to pay my utilities?
Yeah.
Was there ever a time in your life where you felt like you were housing insecure? Are you motivated by some backstory there?
Yeah. I was as a very young child, my parents we volunteered in a walk for the homeless, and it hit me as, I think it made an impression, certainly. What did it mean to be homeless as a young child? I didn't understand that. I've had the great fortune of housing security in my own life. When I was 23 or 24 years old, I bought a deed-restricted home in Boulder. And that, and I watched then as my peers were renting and seeing their rents increase quite rapidly. Well, I sort of had that stability. So, and then, moving here, it was challenging because the choices and the inventory is small and the choices are very much constrained. But I had the good fortune to be able to afford something. So, more it's been an observation of those close to me than my own experience.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's hyperbole at all to say that there are few things that are as important to people as housing.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't have a place to live, if you don't have a stable, safe, affordable place to live, nothing else seems to fit in your life. Do you think, because you've mentioned homelessness, I think the consciousness in society about homelessness has come a long way. Do you think we're starting to catch up with this idea that there's this whole other pool of people that aren't homeless, but they're suffering nonetheless? Are we starting to, as a society, really get that?
I think so, because I think we see now this housing issue affecting, pretty much all sectors of our society except the very wealthy. And so, people moving to our valley here in Gunnison, who are accepting well-paying jobs still aren't able to find housing they can afford. And, that the sort of I think everyone knows someone who has a housing horror story. So yes, I would say that the awareness and sort of who's impacted has become much broader.
And is that making it easier at the policy level to come up with solutions? I mean, more people at the table?
Yeah.
Is that translating?
But so the challenge is greater, and also the political will is greater. So I think that does really present opportunities. I would observe that places that have never grappled with housing issues before are doing so now. And for example, I'm working in western Montrose County, and they're doing sort of their first go round on housing work out there. Or Archuleta County down Pagosa Springs, just did their first housing strategic plan and are putting together a public-private partnership to get some housing built. And and then here locally all four of our local jurisdictions are really actively engaged in housing. So I'd say yes, there is really good work going on at the policy level.
Well, and it strikes me that your focus area with your business and your work is Western Colorado.
Right.
That's where we live, and furthermore, we live in a ski resort area, so a mountain resort area.
Yeah.
But this conversation isn't limited to those places. Right? I mean, would you agree with that? That You've already mentioned some places that aren't ski areas. They're
Absolutely.
just, working class, maybe even agricultural communities. Why do you think now places like that are starting to experience the same problems that maybe mountain resorts have been dealing with for a long time?
Yeah. Great question. I think, certainly some aspects of the housing shortage are national. So there's sort of the cycle that occurred when there was a lot of building activity before the recession. It contracted. We lost a lot of skill and expertise in building, and also ability to do what's required financially and from a land use perspective. And it took a really long time to grow that back, even as our economies were getting more traction. So there's a macro story there.
Right.
And then, throughout then Colorado, just as a desirable place to live, has had a huge impact. I think migration into the big metro areas, and then kind of the ripple effects into our more rural. Looking at Delta County, for example, I was recently out there, and very historically affordable place, and they're struggling to keep their public sector and teachers and so forth housed.
Because there is almost sort of this, I don't know, diaspora of people from urban areas.
Absolutely.
That is having a big impact.
And relative to large coastal markets, we still look very affordable, so people can.
Well, the key word you just said was relative.
Right.
Because wages
right.
do not move at the same pace.
They haven't in a couple decades.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is another big macro issue, no
Certainly.
matter where you're living.
Yes.
That's something that is a problem everywhere.
Yeah.
So you've also mentioned something that you said that really strikes me as a key part of this equation, and that is the pace of change with increases in rent is not the same as the pace of change with, say, a rebounding economy.
Right.
You said we had this downturn in 2008, although I think that's a mild word for it. We ought to start calling it something else.
Right.
Especially in communities that were hardest hit, like ours.
Great recession. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the recovery happens at a certain pace, but housing doesn't catch up at the same pace. Is that sort of this structural, perennial fact of life that we're always going to have to live with? Or are there ways to deal with that?
Yeah. I think that, some of it is it takes a long time to get housing done. Even in, a place where you have a really expedited land use approval and permitting process, it's a complex process to put together a project, and from securing the land, designing it, securing the necessary approvals, and then getting the financing and getting it built. I mean, I haven't seen a lot of ways that gets elegantly compressed.
No, that's a multi-year process.
It's a multi-year process, and so that and then there's a lot of risk. So, what I've been seeing recently is just rapidly escalating construction costs are adding to that. So you can't hit the original schedule and price point you had planned, and so that attracting talent and capacity of people who are willing to take on those risks is a big problem, especially in some of our smaller communities.
And risk to whom? The taxpayer or developers?
In this
combination?
It depends who's the project sponsor.
Yeah.
But it's really in either case, a lot of the projects I'm working on are public-private partnerships. So how that risk is shared is sort of negotiated on a project-by-project basis. But yes, it would be if a local jurisdiction was putting land underneath the project and they were expecting a certain price point to serve local workers, and then the cost to actually build it exceeds that, how are we going to handle that?
Right. Well, all of those big picture questions. But
Yeah.
back to my question. What can be done?
Yeah,
Anything at all? Because it's conceivable that you have a big boom cycle,
Right.
like we're in now. The shortage is acute.
Yeah.
It's painful. Everybody's on board. By the time you get one of these projects or multiple projects through the pipeline, you're in another bust cycle.
Oh, it's completely maddening.
Yeah, it happens all the time, right?
So, and I think that, the answer I would give there is that not losing sight of the problem in the downturn, right? Because when you get into that bust cycle, it's sort of like, oh, we don't have a housing problem anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing that, that is that very much is the nature of our economy in the West. The boom and bust. And the places I think that have been most successful have been consistent and used those downturns as opportunities to keep their work going and to actually take advantage of some of the, the talent, contractors and architects and so forth who need the work during that time.
Well, how do you pay for it in a bust cycle like that?
Great question. You do need to have those resources.
Yeah. What are some of the successes that you can point to where they have cracked that nut and figured it out?
I think Breckenridge has been really consistent. Town of Crested Butte has been pretty consistent. Just sort of continuing to doggedly work on it over time and maintain that political will even as you're having other stressors that the downturn brings.
Yeah. Where do you find the political will for that when everybody is struggling and suffering and tax revenues are down?
I wish I knew the answer.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I mean, I think some places have sort of bring that wisdom or longevity of trying to tackle a project, and it very much depends upon who's elected.
Yeah, and I guess that's a little bit easier to come by in communities that have been dealing with it for a long time.
True. Yep.
Perhaps it's like, okay, we've been here before. We know this is not.
Let's continue to build on our successes.
Yeah.
This isn't going to go away.
In recent conversations with others on this subject, I've been really challenged to stop talking about housing in terms of units. That's such a
terrible word.
Stale, awful.
It's like widgets.
Institutional word.
Yeah.
We're talking about homes.
Yes.
What does it mean? What do you think it ought to mean to a society when such a large portion of its citizenry are living with this kind of insecurity? I mean, let's talk about this as a human dimension.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I had heard or read everyone needs someone to love, meaningful work, and a place to call home, to be sort of fulfilled or to actualize themselves. And the place to call home, let's visualize what that is. And, do you get that sense of relief and security walking in your front door? And I think that's very much the work I'm trying to do.
Mm-hmm. And the question really is, why do we still think of this as a policy issue? There's an intersection always between policy and social justice. There has to be. But we still think of it as a policy issue. How are we going to form these mechanisms? There's another word that's, sort of dry and mechanical. Do you think that there needs to be a greater effort to really frame this as a human disaster of sorts? And if we did, would policy be easier to manage? Is that dimension missing is the question.
I think it can always be stronger, right? And sort of to what the conversation we were having earlier about is this affecting more people, and does that sort of make us more aware? And the absolute yes there. And then I think how to share those stories and both the successes and the challenges through that human lens. I think there's good work happening there, but there could be a lot more.
So that's kind of a storytelling challenge, really.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I keep using these
and it's
words.
such a private, experience as well.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think inherently home should be a private space, and the elements of stress and financial strain and those type of things also tend to be a bit, they're sort of experienced on the household or the individual level, and so they're not always visible.
Well, that brings up a good point, too. They're not always visible, and people aren't always that willing to share either.
Yeah.
I did a series of interviews not that long ago with people in this very situation. And honestly, I had a hard time finding them.
Right.
Even though I knew very well they were there.
And people are resilient and optimistic and adapt, and there's.
Well, and they're reluctant to say, yes, we're hurting.
Yeah.
Because that's not something you want to stand up and wave your hands in a community and say, yeah, we need help. Right. And so raising awareness has to be part of the solution here. It can't just be about, okay, well, what tax credits are going to, allow us to.
Right.
That's sure. Let's do that. We have to do that. But it's also about putting a human face and telling the stories. All right. In your experience, what are the things in this realm that have been tried that absolutely do not work, that we should just walk away from right now and never go there again?
Wow.
I mean, and are there any?
Yeah. I guess I always sort of stay open to rediscovering or refreshing strategies that have been tried before. One of those certainly to me is modular construction. There's a lot to be said for the efficiencies of building in a closed environment in a factory, but there's some downsides around having that labor occur outside your community, and sometimes there's quality issues, or but
there's
then
transportation costs.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's that's one that I've been tempted to say, let's not do any more of that, and then it's really making a resurgence now as construction costs are so challenging. Another thing, for a long time in the United States, the federal policies around affordable housing were to match rents with incomes, and it becomes a disincentive to grow your income.
Disincentive is actually kind of a mild word there, because in some cases it actually forces people. They have to make that conscious choice. Absolutely. I can't afford to take this better paying job, because then where would we live?
Yeah, or I can't even afford maybe to work these extra hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's clearly an example of something that, okay, it had good intentions behind it to begin with, but we're learning. Yeah,
and I think, with that change, one thing we've lost is our ability to serve the very lowest income people, and maybe people who are on a fixed income retirement or disabled, or just have. So the tools we have typically are able to help our moderate and middle income members of our community more easily. So that continues to be a challenge, but I think that it's probably a tool there's pretty much consensus on moving away from.
Well, so what are the exciting, innovative things that we might replace some of those things
Absolutely.
with?
So I think no housing policy or housing project gets built with a single tool. It's really always a coming together of strategies that are responsive to the local market and the local sort of political and physical environment. And that's one of the things I love about this work, is sort of trying to tailor those solutions and come up with, find those intersections of what's going to work. And I think, some of the most exciting tools certainly are local funding sources. So then, if a community is generating its own dollars for housing, then it's also figuring out how it wants to spend those dollars, and they're not reliant upon state or federal resources that are very, that have a very prescriptive box, and are scarce and hard to come by.
Right.
So communities, and that also helps with that consistency over time, being able to invest local resources. And that can take a lot of different shapes in terms of land or general fund dollars or taxes passed by local initiatives, or there's some creative things going on right here with our local foundation, Housing Foundation for the Gunnison Valley. And those local funding sources, they make up a really small sliver of the total cost to build a house, but they kind of they can make the difference in serving who the community really needs, or what who's been identified as, and they can make the difference between a project that is financially feasible or is not.
Right.
So that's certainly one tool
Okay.
that I'm very I think is very positive. Another tool, and I think this comes at the risk of being people get in a silver bullet mentality about public-private partnerships.
Right.
But they're absolutely, I almost everything that's being done in the arena of housing solutions has some public and some private participation. And when the strengths of the different players are really harnessed in a way that has synergy, that really is one of, I do see that as one of the most promising tools.
Well, it's easy for us to visualize what the public side of that equation is, because you've mentioned it, taxes, land donations, so forth, waiving fees, all of that stuff is what falls into that public side. What does private participation look like? What are some of the innovative ways that private organizations and developers and so forth can get involved?
Yeah. So, I think of this throughout the entire sort of arc of a project. There's a lot of private expertise from the private sector you need to be successful, from architects and engineers, developers and contractors, financing agencies. Often when we're talking about, the public sector bringing a portion of what it takes to get a project done, more than half may be coming from a traditional financing mechanism, a bank or investors. And so each of those steps has a private component to it. And often those are skill sets that the public sector doesn't want to, or doesn't have the capacity or the feeling that that's their role to actually have those on board, or the volume of projects.
Right.
So and then there's also, I think, the risk, the issue of profits and risk sharing. So certainly any public sector nonprofit project sponsors tend to be just driven by the public benefit and the mission. And then bringing in a private sector partner can be, there can be an opportunity for them to make some profit, but also participate or, create a buffer if there's a downside to the project.
Right. Well, if increased private involvement is one of the things you're pointing to and saying, hey, this is a positive development.
Yeah.
Is there a scenario you can imagine where it would be all private? Because there are a lot of people who still are in that mindset, and maybe legitimately so. Why do we need public involvement at all? And is public involvement one of the reasons why it takes so long, for instance, to get something through the regulatory and policy and planning process? Can private organizations, private developers, the private marketplace ever, in your mind, handle this problem?
I think there has been certainly points in our history when it has. Now is not one of them, and it's really that structural problem of it costs more to deliver to this housing than our local workforce can afford. And so that public participation helps to make up that gap. And does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And
because I think, and I would say if the private sector is meeting this need, let's not intervene. But clearly it's not.
Mm-hmm. Are there any places where it is and has successfully done so? And I bring this up because it is an argument that you hear quite frequently when this subject comes up, in a group of people that represents lots of different viewpoints. Somebody wants to know why the free market can't do this.
Right. Yeah, I definitely. I mean, I would love to see the free market solving this problem more than it is, you know? And so I think there are certainly situations in which housing that's affordable is being built without a public-private partnership. But I'm not very many are coming to mind, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so it's probably one of those things that theoretically,
right,
there ought to be a way to do this, but we're not finding it.
it's that I think that there's that sort of structural market problem of, I need the rents to be this at this level so that the local workforce can afford them. It's going to cost me this to do the project. With the rents I'm getting, I can only borrow so much, and there's just a giant gap.
Yeah. So it's a mathematics
sort of a mathematics issue, yeah. And I think there's there's so many constraints in the housing world. Land is a constraint, construction costs, access to financing. It's really cracking that nut of trying to reduce construction costs while maintaining quality. Again, it's sort of back to this the modular conversation. It's like if someone found a way, that would be tremendous. What I see more often is we're going in the other direction of we're wanting, for good reasons, to increase quality. To have higher energy efficiency and more safety measures,
longevity,
better quality aesthetics, and all sorts of things that drive our costs up. And those are appropriate and responsive to community values, but they are adding a cost burden. Yeah.
Well, another argument that you hear frequently is if government regulation would just get the heck out of the way, this wouldn't be so expensive. What's your answer to that?
It's certainly a great add-on to what we were just talking about because, which government regulations exactly?
That's the counter-argument. I hear that a lot.
Yeah, because it's sort of, a lot of the regulations and the things that do drive costs up are in place for good reason. We want to maintain health and safety and aesthetics in our community. Those are part of what the job of government to take care of. And I haven't, the other thing I think that's a key there is that, what does our zoning look like? And what, I have seen some very good work around let's really examine our regulations and make sure they are aligned with what we're trying to do. And, a lot of communities I work in haven't really done that soul searching on the regulations in 20, 30 years. So there's good progress in moving the needle in that environment. I don't think I've heard of anyone sort of throwing the rule book out and, having no regulation and then being successful.
Right. And well, that was the question. In places where that sort of analysis has taken place, what do they find? That we can lower the cost by 5, 10, 15%?
All kinds of interesting things. We can often things like open space requirements and side yard setbacks and parking, I was working in a community recently where they were requiring 2 parking spaces per bedroom, regardless of the size of the unit. And, that's just taking a lot of land and resources. It's actually when you start to sketch out, well, how would I build some townhomes on this parcel? You can't fit them because of the parking. And so often those regulatory soul-searching missions get into some very technical nitty-gritty that can really change the project economics. So I do recommend that. Yeah.
Well, and an interesting point, and really one I would like to leave on, we're almost out of time, is the perceptions among some people often that this whole process is just sort of out of our hands. That it belongs to the experts and they're making all these decisions and we just have to live with them. But the fact of the matter is these policy reviews are all done in public meetings.
Absolutely.
And people who are concerned about these things and want to weigh in on things like yard setbacks and parking requirements and snow removal and whatever those issues might be have an opportunity to do that.
Yes.
Do you see a trend toward greater we've already said public awareness of this issue, but involvement, showing up at the meetings and getting involved in this, and how this is going to actually look on the ground?
Yeah. Yes, a recent example. So I've been working with the city of Gunnison on the Lazy K Ranch, which the city had purchased for park space. There's a wetlands component, and there's actually some existing housing and some potential for some more housing. And they were seeking, again, in that vein of we are not housing experts ourselves, but we see this as a very high priority. To enter into a public-private partnership. So they ran a public process in which the potential partners all presented to the public and in a couple of open house formats and these sort of rapid presentations and Q&A. And we had great turnout, really great, diverse perspectives, really thoughtful feedback out of those that then helped the selection committee that was made up of parks and planning and elected officials. It helped them to make their decision, and I thought that was a pretty good.
That's the way it's supposed to
kind
work.
of public engagement at its best. And I definitely think the projects I've seen where engagement is happening early in the process and people are actually able to shape the vision and the what are the most important priorities of what this work's going to accomplish can really move the needle. So
that's our challenge then.
Yes.
To people who are suffering, and that's not a word that's misplaced. There's a lot of suffering around this issue.
Yeah.
But you can get involved. You can show up at these meetings. You can have your voice heard. Because it's not impossible.
Yes.
Willa, thanks for the conversation. I've appreciated it very much.
Thank you. So fun to talk about these issues. We'll continue forward.
I think we're not going to run out of things to talk about anytime soon around this topic.
Yes, when we solve it, that will be exciting.
All right. Well, thanks for your work.
Thank you.
Think Radio Presents is a production of Alan Morris Media. The show's producer is Isa Forrest. Associate producer, Aaron Lewis.
Thanks for listening. Become a Think Radio Presents partner at patreon.com, and you'll also get access to premium content you won't find anywhere else. To leave a comment on today's show or to suggest a great story for a future episode, visit thinkradiopresents.com. Tune in next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think People.